I think everyone in this room would agree that it's been a very challenging time for company boards. The post-COVID adjustment coinciding with a community and customers with short fuses and little time for real or perceived transgressions. And whether that's around service delivery or price or profit or even privacy, there's a long list of issues which are always on the board table, but if you fall short, they rapidly end up on the kitchen table as well. So how do those in Australia's top boardrooms balance the competing issues? For this conversation, please welcome Philip Chronican, Chair of the National Australia Bank and Non-Executive Director of the Woolworths Group, Alana Rubin, Non-Executive Director, and Scott Perkins, Chair of Woolworths and Chair of Origin. If you could welcome our panellists this morning. Thank you all for being here. I know that you weren't in the room earlier for this conversation, but it was one I think that resonated with a lot of people. We heard from Rani Hong about the issue of modern slavery, but from the perspective of someone who has experienced it firsthand, being sold into slavery, now working to try and stop it, really, globally. So I wanted to start by asking each of you where modern slavery sits in terms of governance within your organisations. Once a year as a board you sign off under the Act, but for the rest of the time, what happens? Scott, if I can ask you first.
Thank you, Ellie, and great to be here, and thank you, AXI, for inviting me and putting on this event. So, look, I think it's one of these areas that is developing at a breakneck speed in terms of both the understanding of the issues, the tools that we need to have in place in order to identify and manage those risks, and how, as board members, we go about overseeing those risks. In a practical sense, at Woolies, this filters up to the Sustainability Committee. That's a regular agenda item, and the strategy is discussed at that point, and obviously the Modern Slavery Report comes through that and is signed off at the board. And so please go and look at our Modern Slavery Statement. It's on our website. I think it's presented some quite challenging resourcing and practical implementation issues for us. If you think about the thousands of suppliers we have, the way we stratify them into different risk buckets, and where we focus our risk management activities, obviously starting with our highest risk suppliers, highest risk commodity groups, and then what we do to report on that, to actually demonstrate to our stakeholders that we're taking it seriously. And I'll give you one good example in the interest of time. In 2022, we discovered a Malaysian snack food provider, supplier of ours, that upon our audit, we discovered were not complying with labour practices according to our standards. And so we alerted them, we worked with the local authorities, and after a year or so, we were still not happy with the progress they'd made on rectifying their wage underpayments and various other rights of access, health and safety, union representation. So ultimately what we did was we published their name, included the whole case study in our sustainability report, and through that process brought them to the table to remediate part, and then Woolworths stepped in, and from memory it was an additional $650,000 of wage underpayment that we paid in order to address what we thought was a material modern slavery issue in our supplier base. So risk, tools, reporting, transparency, this is, we've seen that all in other contexts. It's alive and well in modern slavery.
It's interesting, a question that Louise was asking earlier, but just the quickness with which people will jump on any issue that you have and you identify, does that work as a disincentive as opposed to an incentive to look hard and root out issues?
You can't boil the ocean. You have to start with where your material risks are. And we went through, I think, a very rigorous process to work out, for example, our material commodity risks in terms of procurement are in seafood, in cocoa and in coconut. And to actually start there, really get to understand your supplier network, really get in place expectations and the right contractual arrangements, the right rights of access, the right rights of audit. And then you'll work your way through to much lower risk situations with multinationals in your home market, for example, who've got very high standards of reporting that you can rely on vicariously. So you have to adopt a risk-based approach, or else you'll try to do it all well and you won't do much of it well.
Alana, do you see it at all differently?
No, I think the processes in the companies that I'm associated with are very similar, where we do a lot of work through committee that comes up to the board, and we've spent a lot of time putting in place the right reporting and see-through mechanisms to really understand what's happening in our supply chain. I think the interesting thing for me, though, is where we stop looking at it as a compliance activity and we start looking at it as a way to improve our businesses and our supply chain. And I can think of a number of areas where regulation has actually changed the way we've looked at issues, where it's been to the betterment of the organisation. And, you know, for many of you in the room, we'd all think about diversity as an example, where the reporting of diversity started with many companies thinking it was a compliance activity, but really it was an activity where there was a strong business case for improving performance. And I think the opportunity as we work through modern slavery is to make sure we've got, as Scott says, we prioritise well, we've got our processes right, we know what is happening, and then link that to actually the business case and business improvement, and link modern slavery into our broader procurement, into our talent programs, so we actually really make a difference in how we operate rather than see it in a very narrow sense.
Phil, can I ask you, these are sort of the processes and the sorts of processes people in the room would want to hear, but as we know, this is not as easy as saying we're going to do this, off we go. There is a real issue with information.
There is a information issue. Scott's spoken about supply chain of product and goods into Australia. We tend not to have a supply chain that is high risk from that viewpoint. The things we consume from outside Australia are pretty vanilla. But that's not to say there aren't modern slavery risks that are quite significant within our customers' activities. And the other trap to fall into is assuming that modern slavery is an offshore issue. We are exposed domestically to aspects of modern slavery as well, and that's become overlapping with some other risk characteristics that we find. So as we, through our risk lens, when we're taking on customers and monitoring customer activity, modern slavery is actually a real exposure that we have both onshore and offshore with customers.
Let's go to I guess, the issue that I was alluding to in the opening here. The three of you cover essential services, so things like food, energy, telecommunications, the sort of stuff that we all use multiple times every day. Alana, we've seen what happens with Qantas, I guess, when short-term profitability clashes with the customer expectations. So how do you balance the profitability and the customer experience?
There's a lot of discussion around that balance in all the boardrooms, and it's been really interesting to see how profit has become such a topic of discussion, and more recently the need to generate profit. And Paul Schroeder, who I know is in the audience, talked about the need for profit to grow the pie, grow the collective pie, and that's certainly true. We need our companies to be profitable so we can invest in services, invest in product, invest in innovation, invest in a way that provides our investors a fair rate of return. So without profit, we don't have companies, but equally without customers, we don't have companies. And so getting that balance right is really important. And the conversations that we're having around the board table is very much focused on what is our value proposition? Are we delivering real value to customers? What is our service proposition? Can we stand behind the service that we're delivering to customers and at the price points? Have we got a number of entry points that customers can pick from the services that we provide? Certainly not clear cut, but really important discussions and nuanced. We're also having discussions about how we deal with vulnerable customers and those in the community that are finding it hard to pay for services. And so at board, we're far more aware of the hardship provisions that we have, how we're triaging customers to make sure we're delivering the best service for them and treating them well. And I think that value proposition is really critical as we think about how we price.
So that's from the customer point of view. What about from the shareholder point of view?
From a shareholder point of view, we're engaging with our shareholders continuously about their return on investment, and we have to defend the stance that we take. There'll be some that think that, you know, telcos, for example, aren't going fast enough, but the capital management plans need to be well articulated, well laid out, but certainly cognizant of the need to deliver to customers as we move through that.
Phil, you, of course, not you, well, you personally to an extent, but certainly financial services, you've had your moment with the Royal Commission. I guess 5 years on, what are the lessons from that for other boards? And if you've got community expectations that are not met, do you question the expectation? Because sometimes the expectation might be right, sometimes it might be wrong. Do you question it?
I think, well, first of all, you need to understand it. And I think if you look at case studies of companies that have, in a sense, got into difficulty in their public profile, in the way the media and politicians treat them, it often is because they have misunderstood, in a sense, a silent expectation on them. And that's where I think we do need to understand. We went through it with the Royal Commission, but we're not immune from it today. We have a number of issues where the economics of our business drive us to have to do certain things that not everybody thinks is the way that they want to go. And it's important that we don't lose sight of what that community expectation is. So, rural branch closures is obviously a very significant one at the moment. I've been to many of these rural branches. There's very few people going into them. We offer a whole range of other services, but obviously from a community standpoint, it touches a raw nerve in small local communities. So I think it's incumbent on an organisation to truly understand what it is that the public have as their expectation of them, not what they've talked themselves into internally. And that requires people to get out, listen, because you very rarely learn these insights sitting around your own head office. So I think it's an external view that companies need to engage in. Now, it may be that in some cases the community expectation isn't realistic, in which case you do have a clear obligation to start talking more openly about what the value proposition you're offering is. But I would endorse what Ilana was saying, which is in the long run, the strength of your customer franchise is the health of your business. And if you're reliant on short-term profits from things that are not sustainable, then that's not a great basis for valuation. And you need to be thinking about how do you build something which in the long run generates value to consumers so they are prepared to pay an economic price for the services you offer. That's the only long run success.
Scott, what are your thoughts, I guess, on where supermarkets find themselves right now? Everyone's read the headlines, seems to be a constant thing. I think you've got 10 different inquiries at the moment.
I think we've only got 7, but that could be updated.
You may have missed one.
I'm overinflating it, I'm sorry about that.
That could be this morning's news. So maybe I'll just build on what Eleanor and Phil have said. What is our duty? Our duty is to act in the best interest of the corporation. The best interest of the corporation requires you to think more broadly than just customer, just team, just shareholder, just community. And I think it's now really well understood and embedded in corporate Australia, as I know it is in this room, that when you get that balance right, the flywheel works in favour of everybody. Better customers, longer term customer lifetime value, more engaged people will lead to better customer service, that will lead to better market share, that will lead to more profits. So that flywheel and attending to it and constantly assessing the right balance is what we've been doing for quite some time. We're now doing it in a world where we're under, I think, increasing scrutiny from everybody. And by and large, that's a good thing, right? And we have to live up to what we say. We have to actually prove it by our actions, not just our words. Some of that scrutiny needs a little bit of evidence-based, and we look forward to the ACCC and the various committees that are investigating issues of market concentration and pricing behaviour. We actually welcome those to actually get the facts on the table. We look forward to putting our case that in respect to supermarket competition in 2008, when the market was found to be workably competitive, and Aldi had 180 stores, today they have nearly 600. Amazon really wasn't in the market. They are now. Costco wasn't in the market. They are now. The centre of the grocery store is present in Bunnings, in Reject Shop, and a bunch of other channels. The Chemist Warehouse.
But they don't sell fresh fruit and veg, and that's where a lot of the headlines have been of late.
Aldi does sell fresh fruit and veg.
Bunnings doesn't.
No, but I said centre of grocery. Yeah, centre of store, so grocery products. So absolutely, we look forward to making that case, and I think we look forward to the ACCC considering that. I think we also appreciate that with employing 204,000 people in pretty much every community in Australia, we play a critical role in the overall health and well-being of the Australian economy. What does that mean? It means that actually delivering for our customers, providing rewarding place of employment for those 204,000 people across the group, and generating good returns to our shareholders, that's the challenge. And we absolutely have to deliver on all three, and all three will be self-reinforcing, and that flywheel, I think, will play out. I think to the point that Eleanor emphasised, and obviously a point that's well understood in this room, you know, in many respects, whether it be NAB or whether it be Woolies or whether it be Telstra, these are proxies for the bigger challenge facing the Australian economy. The big question, the big challenge in the Australian economy at the moment is labour productivity. High increases in wages, if not backed with labour productivity, will result in sustained high interest rates. What's the key to labour productivity? A business environment that encourages capital investment in people, productivity that ultimately leads to the ability to pass on lower prices and be more competitive. So we need to be able to stand up to our shareholders, to the broader community and say, actually, the fact that Woolworths is a profitable company, the fact that we think we probably have the world's leading digital and e-commerce capability, so we're told by many other retailers, is something to be proud of, not something to be apologetic for.
I guess I've got a question here from the audience, but it does go to the heart of the issues that you're facing. But the question is in the context of all of your businesses. What are your comments on the allegations of the lack of competition within Australia, in supermarkets, in telcos and in banks? Why don't I go to you first, Phil? I'll give you a break, Scott.
I think banking has obviously had massive competitive pressures over the years, and that's evidenced by the fact that interest margins today are about half what they were 20 years ago. And bearing in mind that for most people, the banking services they get are free or next to free. So, I think there's something like 30 or 40 different mortgage providers. There's probably 30 or 40 different providers of transaction accounts in the country. So it's true that it's competitive, but it's also true that there is a high degree of concentration. And that's a scale effect that you have in the Australian economy. There are 2 large airlines and a handful of small ones. There are 4 large banks and a large number of small banks. There are 2 to 3 large supermarket chains and a large number of small grocers. So there is a certain structural element to the competitive landscape in Australia. But the issue is competition shouldn't be measured by the number of participants in it, but by the outcomes, which are prices competitive, are margins being competed down, and are there artificial barriers to competition? Because sometimes even just the threat of competition, i.e. if you've got low barriers to entry, that itself is a moderating force. So I think it really requires people to step back and go, rather than focusing in on how many participants there are in a market, the question is how competitive is the outcome from that market? And I think you do get different answers to those 2 questions in many industries, not necessarily all. but certainly in many industries. And just if I could just finish one there, because it's got nothing to do with me. Qantas is a good example. There's a lot of criticism of Qantas using its market power to hold up fares, but progressively over the last year, as we've seen more and more of the foreign entrants getting into the international travel market, prices have firmly come down, and that's market competition at work.
Scott, can I just ask you, I know that you've been very clear that you feel it is a very competitive space that you're in. Do you expect, of these 7 inquiries that you're currently being subjected to, do you expect change to come out of that?
I think there will always be something come out of that we can learn from, absolutely.
But I mean regulatory change.
I really don't know how where the ball's going to bounce there. I think we've obviously got submissions in respect of the Grocery Code of Conduct, and we certainly would welcome some change in regulation there. So I think nobody's perfect. We'll learn from it. There'll be things that we'll be very proud of, and there'll be maybe the other thing we're disappointed with. That's the nature of it. So but in terms of the core questions being asked, I think we do have a reasonably clear perspective and degree of conviction on it.
Do you think there will be competition change, though? Regulatory change?
I think there could well be regulatory change, yes, in respect of the Grocery Code of Conduct. Broader competition and regulatory change, I'm not sure.
If I could ask you, Ilana, about just still on this issue of community expectation and also customer expectation and the quickness to jump on missteps, perceived or real, how much of that do you think goes to trust and where trust is right now in the community?
I think a lot of it is how the community feels, not just about corporations, but about institutions. And if you think about what's happening globally, we've seen over the last few years, even before COVID, a slow decline in the community's trust of large institutions, whether it be government, civil institutions, or corporations. And we've seen that in the US, we've seen it in Europe, we've seen it in the UK, we've seen it here. And, personally, I think that's just really distressing, because I believe in the benefits of having a strong community, and a strong community is, in a sense, based on trust, that we trust our institutions to do the right thing by us, and we all behave collectively to support that. And I certainly feel there's been a reduction in trust across the board. In Australia, in corporate Australia, we've certainly had some instances where we have failed that trust that's been given to us. But by and large, I think boards and companies do want to do the best thing by their broad stakeholder group, and that is by their investors, by their customers, by their employees, and the communities in which they operate. But without a level of trust, every misstep becomes huge, and there's very little goodwill to just step back and let companies work through the issues and explain what's happened. And sometimes those explanations take some time to work through. I recall being on at a directors forum about 6 years ago with the crisis management team, and their advice was to companies that you should only go out in the event of a crisis to the public once you have all the answers. And I just think you can't do that today. It takes a long time sometimes to get all the answers, and the trust requires transparency, it requires access and visibility. And so in the event of a crisis today, I think it's incumbent on all of us to go out as early as we can, but with a little bit of knowledge, be really open and transparent about what we know in the circumstances, and then update customers, employees, regulators, stakeholders as the situation unfolds. By putting ourselves forward in that way, I hope that over time we'll be able to rebuild trust. But at the moment, I think there is a trust deficit.
That's the absolutely classic case that if you don't go out there, someone else will.
That's exactly
the space
right.
will be filled. Phil, do you see it as the role of boards to try and rebuild trust? I mean, obviously you try and rebuild it by what you do in the normal course of your business, but is there something else that boards should be looking at to try and shift this deficit?
A bit caught here between what a board can do and what a board can influence. Obviously, the board's role is overall governance, and therefore we need to make sure that people are addressing the right issues. So I think it's not, I think, completely wrong to say that a board should have a longer-term perspective and a more outward-looking perspective than you would expect of a leadership team in a business, because they've got all the internal pressures on them. It can be hard when you're in those roles to step back and make those connections with the external community. And I think it's the role of the board to make sure that that's not overlooked. And the board should be questioning the management team, should be prodding the management team to make sure that they're not doing things that may endanger the trust that they need to have with their community, so their customers, their suppliers, the broader community. Because the health of the brand, the long-term health of the brand is about the long-term value of the company. And I think it is right for a board to be actively engaged on those issues. Now, what a board itself can do? No, not a lot. What can it influence the management team to do? Quite a lot.
And I guess that also, this goes to a question from the floor. Do you feel boards can actually really understand the challenges faced by everyday customers, considering the separation boards have from these consumers? This goes to your point about getting out.
Getting out. And that's why, Woolworths do it, because I've been involved at NAB. We take the board out, we get them in where the customers are and get them to see what that experience is. Now, it's easy at a supermarket because I'm up at the Neutral Bay Woolies every second week myself, having the customer experience. But it's, we take our board at the bank to go and listen to customers. We took a group out to Parramatta, where we've got one of our contact centres, listening to hardship calls, because that's a big thing at the moment. And it's important. And we set up a board customer committee after the Royal Commission explicitly with that purpose of making sure that the board didn't lose sight of what the day-to-day customer experience of people using our services was. And particularly at this time when hardship incidences are on the increase, it was really valuable and insightful for the board just to go and listen firsthand to what the customers are calling up about, and the pressure the customers are under, and the stresses they are feeling with the financial stresses they're going through.
That does go to economic environment, which I want to have a look at the outlook in a minute. But Scott, if I can ask you to put your Origin hat on, and not your Woolworths one, how much harder was it to balance the competing interests that we've been talking about, customer and shareholder, during the Brookfield bid?
So it was entirely the customer offering, the day-to-day operations, the execution of our strategy were almost entirely unaffected. And we worked hard to mitigate the impact of what was necessary from a resourcing perspective to keep as many of the key ELT members focused on the business, not on matters of corporate control. Having said that, it is a time sink for certain parts of the organisation, and I'm sure at times proved to be a distraction. So it was very much part of our job to be communicating consistently as to why we were doing what we were doing, and to encourage people to maintain their focus on their customers and their teams and doing what they're really good at. It was significantly helped by the fact that actually that really wasn't a contest. Often in a takeover situation, it's the strategy's rubbish, the board all need to go, we don't back the management team, and to date that hasn't been the case. So it was very much, it wasn't really a contest on strategy per se. It was a contest on people's views of value. And we understood, I think, from the get-go that shareholder democracy invites people to form their own views of that. Our job was to inform, and our job was also not to adopt a deterministic view, but a probabilistic view as to the outcomes. In other words, it's not everything on one scenario. There are always multiple scenarios. There are always varied views, especially in the case of evaluation of Origin Energy, which is hence why we maintained, I think, a consistent and productive dialogue with our major shareholders, whilst they've gone on the public record in terms of their support of that.
And indeed, they're joining us this afternoon, so we'll ask them directly. Right. But I guess there's another question around the bid, and that was this narrative that foreign or international private equity expertise was needed to raise the capital required for the transition. Isn't there a heap of capital available from the people in this room and elsewhere in this country? Do we need the foreign private equity expertise?
The numbers of the energy transition are truly mind-boggling in terms of the amount of capital that will need to be deployed, both in terms of technologies that are well understood and technologies that are yet to be proven, right? And so at one end you might have a PPA solar plant, the other end you might have a hydrogen plant. The supply chain to execute all of that, going from OEM, EPC, planning, actually it's not just about capital and the product. So what I think we saw, and the ACCC also saw that, was that there was demonstrable expertise from the bidder in aspects of that, in terms of the fact that it's done this a number of times before, and could probably adopt a reasonably keen risk-adjusted view of all of that entire supply chain and the whole challenge. Your overarching point is absolutely right, though. There is a lot of capital looking for high-quality opportunities in the energy transition. So when we think about it as a company, we don't think that that's the scarce asset. The scarce asset will be customers. The scarce asset will be high-quality projects that offer attractive rates of return, that can be delivered on budget, dispatched reliably, and that actually ultimately go to creating value for your entire business. So we think we're in a good position to be able to generate those opportunities for many people in this room.
Alana, how is the climate conversation, you all signed up to net zero with your various companies, but how has the climate conversation changed around the board table?
I think it's one of those, it's a conversation that has pleasingly moved from just focused on regulatory compliance to really how do we embed within our business processes a better climate outcome in how we operate. And so the discussion, while we're certainly cognizant of the regulatory reform that's happening around the world and our increased reporting requirements and how we're going to do that, we're also far more granular in the discussion about what it really means for the business. How's it going to impact our physical assets? How's it going to impact our supply chain? How does it impact how we're organising our work? Where does innovation and technology play a role in reducing our climate footprint? And so the discussion has moved very much into our business operations and are far more embedded in how we're managing our business. And I think it's, one of the examples of how corporates might be prodded by a regulatory change and approach it very much from that standpoint, but over time they actually see the benefit in adopting those changes within the business, embedding it within the business for a better business outcome for their shareholders, for their customers and the community more broadly. We're having engagements around, very specific climate action plans around physical assets. We're looking at how we change the supply chain in order to be more climate resistant. We're looking at how we can use technology and AI in a way that just hasn't been possible to date. And all of those means that we're actually looking at the climate issue far more holistically. And I think, it's for the better.
And I'm sure that all three of your companies are doing similar things. But Phil, if I can ask you about the level of compliance now and the amount of regulation around this. And I think a potential issue of losing the aspiration along the way?
I think we're at a potential inflection point. Most large organisations identified that climate risk was real, that if you're going to have a long-term sustainable business, you needed to think about the climate risks inherent in your business model. And again, for banking, for us, it was largely around the activities of our customer base. Our own activities are relatively light footprint. So we look at the climate risk that's presented in our lending book, both from those who were large emitters and therefore were at risk of future regulatory intervention or price disadvantage, and then also for those who would be vulnerable to climate effects. And one of the things we've done is go through the whole home loan book, however many 100,000 home loans we have, and identifying those that are in potentially flood-prone, cyclone-prone areas, i.e. themselves exposed to climate risk. And all that work's been evolving over the last 5 or 6 years, and we learn a lot more as we go. That has been coupled with organisations having aspirations, net zero, 43% reduction in emissions by 2030. And organisations have articulated these aspirations in different ways. That whole body of work now is coming into collision with sustainability reporting standards, with ASICs, warnings to the community about greenwashing. And so there's a risk that organisations are going to have to dial back their aspirational arm to make sure that they're not going to end up in breach on their compliance arm. And I loosely call it that the subject is moving from the sustainability to the audit committee, because now we have to think about statements we make, commitments we make and claims we make through the lens of, can we verify them, what assurance process was there under that data, are we really confident putting that into a document that will be used if we're raising funds, therefore it's part of a, by incorporation in a prospectus.
But isn't that exactly how it should be?
Well, it should be when the science is settled. And where we are at the moment is we haven't yet got to a point where all of the measurement is settled, but we're rapidly getting into that environment of strict liability around disclosures. So I just see us at a point at the moment where we may get the balance slightly wrong if we overweight on the compliance side of it before we have settled the methodologies that we're going to use to drive the transition. And that's the only caution I'm putting out there.
Scott, do you agree?
Yeah, I think I think Phil's nailed it. We've moved from aspiration to execution, from plans to progress, and when you face into execution and measuring and holding yourself to those standards of delivery, you then run into this accounting standard point. And everybody in the director world, and I think everybody appreciates in this room, when we're making forward-looking statements, we do that with a great degree of diligence and caution, right? Forecasts, trading updates, whatever. And we are going to be in a world where certain forms of assurance are going to be needed for forward-looking climate-related commitments. And that's really the area where the assurance tools, the director liabilities, it's very much a live topic for discussion. But in terms of executing on Scope 1, Scope 2, I think the Scope 3 debate is very live in terms of where does the corporate liability start and finish. What influence can, for example, Origin have on Sinopec's consumption of export LNG? We can have a lot of impact on domestic methane mitigation and preventing fugitive leaks, but how does it work when our products are sort of beyond?
Are you saying we
Australian
shouldn't be focusing on Scope 3? We shouldn't be talking to...
No, I don't think so at all. I think they're much harder. It's a different category of potential influence, whereas your Scope 1 and Scope 2, you better get cracking.
I want to
say that I am hopeful that the current regulatory changes that are coming in the reporting requirements won't dampen aspiration. I'm a big believer in having sort of, the light on the hill and, having an aspiration, being able to work towards that. And I think it's so important, not just for the external market, but so important for our employees. And I don't want to lose that. And I think we will be able to navigate a pathway through the regulatory framework while keeping that aspiration.
I've got plenty of other questions, but I do just want to get to some of these from the floor. And Alana, there is a terrific one for you, asking your many years chairing Australian Super, what did you bring from that? What lessons did you learn and take into Australian companies that you're now on the board of?
That is a terrific question, so thank you. Probably two things. One is the importance of purpose. I think purpose is something that really anchors discussion around business and how you weigh up opportunities and how you manage risks and how you allocate capital and how you prioritise. And Australian Super was absolutely crystal clear about the purpose of putting its members first, and that guided its decision making throughout my time and today. The importance of purpose is something I took to the companies that I work with, and indeed it's something that drives me personally. I do think that purpose is a driver for me, and it's something which is really important in how you engage with the company and how you develop a framework for prioritising and making decisions. And I think the second thing that I took is that you can reach agreement with people that you may not see eye to eye with on all issues. And when you're together within a boardroom for a particular purpose and objective, whether it's running a super fund or in a corporate world, you can form bridges and alliances and reach a common ground where you've got a common purpose. And it doesn't mean that you have to agree on every single item or every single matter. So those two things. But thank you very much, whoever asked that question.
Now, another question, which I'll put to you, Scott, because you raised the issue. Businesses often comment around lower productivity not aligning with higher wages, but frequently do not address the fact that company profits outpace wages growth.
So, look, these things all have to intersect, right? And there's not a precise sort of relationship where one will lead to the other. In the case of Woolies, we have a very robust debate with our shareholders about the billions of dollars that we've invested in, for example, supply chain, digital, store renewal, and ensuring we get that return. At the same time, we are in a highly competitive labour market and need to offer attractive employment. So one, I think, great example we've tried to sort of do to really address that and get the best of both worlds. It used to be the case that labour scheduling, and when you've got 200,000 employees and a lot of casual labour as well as part-time but permanent labour, is putting people where the customers need them. And that was often left to sort of central planning and finance, or maybe the store manager had a view as to when people were needed. And of course, people's purchasing patterns have changed dramatically in the last decade or so, such that the weekend days that used to be quiet are very, very busy. So what we did, we developed a very large analytical tool that actually the store managers, we put to the store managers and said, well, look, you historically have been allocating your labour on the basis of sales. In fact, you have to allocate your labour on the basis of units. And you think that this is your trading pattern, but here's actually what the data tells you. And if you overlay what our people are saying they want more hours. They actually want more. The part-time workforce is evolving to be wanting extra hours in the week. So as a result of that artificial intelligence tool, working with our store managers, the new way of measuring productivity, which is on an items per labour hour basis, listening to our people in order to give them a better experience, we completely changed during the course of the last 12 months where we actually allocate labour into stores. It meant that we actually hired tens of thousands of less part-time or seasonal labour, but significantly improved the experience of our permanent part-time workforce who wanted more hours, and we delivered that. So better outcome, through the use of technology and productivity tools.
But you were talking earlier about wages growth needing to be reflected by productivity and that being an issue. And yet I think the point of the question was, well, wages growth never outstrips profit growth. So there is room to move. It seems to be like it's very much the conversation as soon as wages move even the slightest. And we could have a long argument about whether there really is wages growth given how low it's been for such a very long time. But how does that... I mean, how do you respond to that businesses are too quick to latch on to that and not address where profit growth is?
Oh, we absolutely need to meet a competitive labour market. So, I mean, that's what determines where the cost of labour is. So, for example, when Fair Work came out with the recommended minimum wage, we responded within literally 24 hours and paid 100% of it. That was about a bit over 5%. I think our EBIT growth was a bit over 6%. And if you think through the maths of it, you know, labour is a significant cost component, but all other things being equal, you will always get in a rising volume environment some profit accretion over above labour. So you might be meeting a fully competitive labour market and still be able to create a little bit more operating leverage. That's just the way that the maths of it works.
Phil, I'll put this question to you, not necessarily fairly, but why does it take big corporations so long to act when there are clear signs being given by the public on things like service, data protection? Is it purely profits? That questioner finishes with.
No, but it's a question that I've spent a lot of time asking myself, which is why is it that companies who do run into PR issues, community engagement issues, often everyone else on the market can see it before the company itself can. And I think it's this broader issue about, you know, companies there's an internal set of momentum around issues that companies get caught up in managing the issues as they've seen them, and that's my point about getting out and listening. Sometimes miss the point that the communities do have expectations on them that are different. And
can you give me an example of that?
I'm trying to think of one which isn't at this table,
Sure.
But maybe Scott will forgive me if I go back into Woolworths history. And at the time of the leadership changes back in 2015, 2016, you know, Woolworths was being criticised that the Masters business wasn't going anywhere, the prices were too high, they were losing market share, and the stores were shoddy. Now, you know, Woolies was managing a whole lot of issues, I'm sure, very dutifully, but did miss the point that actually it was off track. And then there was a major leadership change, you know, when Gordon came in as chair and Scott as CEO, and they did a reset and addressed many of those issues. Now, I could go around a number of companies that have been through, and I've been and working in many of them because I've worked in 3 of the Australian banks over my career. You know, the banking industry went through the same issue, which is we were so caught up on what we thought were our internal issues about increasing capital requirements, contracting margins, but we missed that engagement with customers that ultimately manifested itself in the Royal Commission. So I think it'd be an interesting sociological study of corporate behaviour, but I just think inside a company, sometimes you're the last to realise what's actually going on, which is why I'm very strong on this view about getting directors out, looking at a customer from the outside in.
And actually, and that, I'll go to that in a tick, but there's a question here that does very much follow on from that. Have boards considered introducing representation that is more closely aligned with broader communities to address misunderstanding community expectations? In other words, actually put a real person on the board, I think is the subtext of that question.
Which I've been very conscious of, that, you know, as I said, we have a customer committee at NAB, and when we're looking at director competencies and profiles, I'm very keen on having somebody who's a little bit countercultural on the board, who does raise the questions that others won't. You know, if we just staffed our board with a bunch of career bankers like me, we would not get that perspective. And that's why we've been quite conscious in our director selection to look for that diversity of thought, somebody who can bring a different
But does it maybe have to be outside the board? Because the boards can become, team play. Well, not necessarily team players, that's unfair, but you know what I mean.
But you need somebody on the board who's prepared to take that perspective, but that's not enough. And but I would expect most boards have active engagement with external parties. You know, we bring along each of our board rounds, we would have 1 or 2. In fact, we've just finished a round last week with we had 4 external parties come in and talk about different parts of their perspectives of our business or of a global perspective. That's an active part of the board program, is to engage external voices.
Scott, what do you think of that question?
It's about diversity of thought, and permanent board membership isn't the only way of achieving that. So I think permanent board membership is clearly a vital, getting the right diversity of thought, and as Phil can attest, the Woolworths board is a vibrant bunch of people with quite different views. So the ability to think independently, to challenge, to be curious, to have the courage to put forward what might be an idiosyncratic view, that's a vital part of good board culture. And then how do you feed in the case of a broad-based consumer business like Woolworths, how do you feed in the various different cohorts of customer perspective? That is I think Phil's nailed it, it's a function of external voices, getting out there and being close to your customers and spending time in stores, listening to store managers. It's about attending customer focus groups and trying to be sufficiently in the business without crossing that line and getting into management, so that you do really have some of those sort of countervailing voices and voices that don't necessarily get the airtime that they deserve.
Ali, while it's certainly true that the best boards are ones with diversity of thought and experience, how you develop diversity of thought is often through the careers that you've had and your own life experiences. And so I do think there's an argument that we should broaden the pool of people that directors come from. We still have a majority of directors that come through either corporate or professional service pathways, and they tend to be later in their career. And how we have a mix of experience and age, backgrounds, ethnicity, different career paths, corporate, non-corporate, around a board table, I actually think would be a strength. That's not to take away from the fact that we all go out and we meet with our customers, we go to regions, we don't have one single customer base. Customers are very diverse themselves. We spend a lot of time trying to bring, I talk about bringing the outside in, because within the business, the teams are, expert, hardworking, driven, and it's really hard sometimes to think that what you're doing is actually not the right thing. You're so committed to it. So there are a number of different avenues to do it, but I do think there is something about broadening the pool of directors.
Can I say, for as long as I've done this conference, which is a really long time, we've had that conversation and we're still having it. So it must be just a bigger challenge than we imagine. We only have literally 2 minutes left. But I wanted to finish by asking each of you, just very briefly, there are so many things that are on the table for boards at the moment, but your number one priority, as you see it, over the next 12 months, and I don't mean the normal profitability, customer service, what do you think is going to be the biggest challenge that you're going to face in the next 12 months? Phil?
I still wake up every morning worried about the whole issue of data security, cyber security, just because it's a dangerous environment out there, and you can overlay onto that the impact that AI could have, triggering a cybersecurity event.
Even in an organisation as big as yours, with the resources that you have.
We're big and we've got a lot of resources, but because we're big, we're also a target. And I think, and partly because of the nature of our business, we're everybody's target. So we've been very successful to date, but it's ongoing vigilance. So.
Ilana?
As you said, there's all the standard issues that we're all thinking about. But for me, it's the pace of change. It's, far quicker. It's coming from all different directions. There's technology and just how our organisations will be able to respond to that, and the load and the pressure it puts on our employees. And so that sort of pace of change is something that I'm really mindful of.
Scott?
Prioritisation.
I thought you were going to say one of the 7 inquiries.
No, we're back to 7. That's good news.
Yes.
So, just prioritisation. How can we what's our job? Our job is to help our management teams make better decisions. There is just literally, business is hard, full stop. and there's just more and more and more landing on their plates in a more and more febrile environment. And how do we help them not only cope but prioritise? So it's all of the everyday stuff, but more than ever, they just can't do everything with sufficient, where are the resources going to come from, making sure that they're all coping. So I think we've got a real role to play in helping them work through what is really important. And that's front of mind for me.
Please join me in thanking our panel of directors very much. Thank you.